What's up, metal and heavy music fans? Today we are ranking the 5th albums from classic death metal bands. Alright, and this will be an interesting one because I really only have 2 that are going to go to perfection tier. So let's start on a strong note here with Death and Individual Thought Patterns in 1993. Now, I think this is one of their best lineups of all time here, with Chuck and Andy LaRocque on guitar, Steve DiGiorgio on fretless bass, and Gene freaking Hoglan on drums.
We're not worthy!
To me, this feels like the perfect melding of speed and intensity of their early albums with the more technical and melodic elements of Human, sort of the best of both worlds, if you ask me. In short, this album can basically be summed up as Human, but better. Mentally Blind is also one of my favorites of this more technical phase, and another one that I had an immediate response to. So again, starting off on a very strong note here with Death going to perfection tier. Let's go to another classic here in Morbid Angel and Formula's Fatal to the Flesh in 1998. This is the first album with Steve Tucker replacing David Vincent, and you know, for a frontman change which could be the kiss of death for a lot of bands, this isn't half bad. In fact, I think it's pretty good. It's another interesting album that goes hard and isn't ever really boring. More great riffs and variety on tracks like Bill or Sag. Nothing Is Not retains some of that Where the Slime Live groove. Imula Mari has some vocal similarities. Chambers of Dis is a great meat grinder. Invocation of the Continual One gets kind of proggy, and it even gets downright experimental towards the end. A bit too long at almost an hour, not one of my all-time favorites from their discography or anything, but I'm going to put it pretty high up on great tier. All right, and then we got to do it 6 Feet Under, Bringer of Blood, 2003.
Oh my god!
An album cover I closely associate with this band and fitting to how they sound.
Oh god, how embarrassing.
Yeah, of course this one's going to perfection. Psych! It's going to okay, not my thing. Next up, let's do Bolt Thrower with For Victory in 1994. I noticed this was the second highest album scored on Metal Storm by the fans with an 8.7. The riffs continue to get more interesting here and also pretty memorable from previous efforts, helping each song kind of stand apart. The 1-2 punch of War and Remembrance makes for a particularly potent opening. Lots of head-bobbing grooves that at times sound influenced by Sepultura in a weird way. It could stand to have a little bit more of a vocal range, but then again, I don't think that this band is really trying to do things with that in mind. Overall, this is definitely one of my higher ranked Bolt Thrower albums, and I'm going to put it at slightly greater tier. And you may have noticed I've changed the ranking a little bit from the previous videos in this series in that I don't have a fantastic tier, I just have a slightly greater tier in that I think it's a little bit more reflective of the grouping that we have here. But of course, as always, let me know down in the comments if you would rank these things differently and why. Alright, next up, let's do Cryptopsy with Once Was Not, 2005. This features the return of Lord Worm on vocals, but is also his last with the band. It's also the first album to not have John Levasseur on guitar, and I'll tell you that classical guitar intro was a welcome reprieve after all the eardrum abuse up to this point. When you go to 11 non-stop, it starts to lose its meaning, and you need these counterpoints to really emphasize the contrast. And I'd say that shift to the cavernous in the kingdom is about as stark a contrast as you can get. Love the little jangly guitar breaks on that one too. Although I will say soon after that, it does kind of fall into the trap of sort of songs running together. I do also enjoy The Curse of the Great, keeping the Cadaver Dogs busy, has kind of a proggy psychedelic vibe in places that reminds me of Gigan. Very chaotic, but almost to a fault. So it's interesting. I'm going to put it kind of lower down on great tier. All right, next up we have Obituary with Back from the Dead, 1997. This was the last album before the initial 6-year breakup and the first not produced by Scott Burns, and you can definitely hear the difference. But really, regardless of sound, the compositions are also extremely tired at this point. I guess Download kind of got me moving, but most of these songs actually made me wish I was just listening to either Helmet or Power Trip instead. So I'm putting this one down at okay, not my thing. Alright, next up we have Incantation with Blasphemy, 2002. So I was a little miffed looking at the runtime of this one going into it, but the title track kicks off on a strong note showcasing the faster and more ominous side of the band that I definitely enjoy. The Fallen is an interesting follow-up too, shifting into that great bass intro before the tremolos take off again, but you know how it goes for me if you've been following the series. Once they slow things down, I start to check out. and it even starts to grate on me a little bit after a while. It's fine, but not something I personally feel inclined to revisit anytime soon. I'm going to put this one at good tier. Let's follow that up with Immolation and Unholy Cult in 2002. So the malevolence is once more on massive scale with this album and delivered delightfully through those rusted machinery sounding riffs. It's a little more stripped back in places, but still has its share of mathy insanity on tracks like Sinful Nature and Wolf Among the Flock. There's some real standout moments, but it also remains pretty consistent throughout the entire runtime. Probably my fourth favorite overall in their discography, and a very strong one above the rest on this list. I'm also going to put this one at greater tier. All right, we have Deicide with Insineratehymn 2000. What a fucking terrible title that is.
How fucking lame.
And it also feels a little bit stripped back and dumbed down, even the cover art for sure. I look at this and I confuse it with like a 6 Feet Under album. Bible Basher is the only song to regularly make it into their live set list too, notably, so the band isn't even particularly fond of this set of songs. I'm going to put this one at okay, not my thing. Let's do Nile with Ithyphallic in 2007. So this album is good, but it just comes off as several steps back from what they'd been doing and leans more heavily into just like classic death metal tropes. Like the atmospheric stuff is still there, but it doesn't seem as intricately woven into the music. Remove those sections and this is very much just like a 90s era sounding brutal death metal album. Others seem to feel the same, as this one drops nearly 10% in rating from the previous albums on Metal Archives. Still, as always, I'd say it's very impressive as far as the performances go, and definitely a few steps above a lot of the other albums on here. I'm going to put it at great tier. Next, we have Suffocation with Suffocation in 2006, and it's always a red flag to me when I see a later career self-titled album. Those tend to either be really great or really mediocre. And fortunately, Suffocation fans, you're finally gonna get a win from me here. I know I've been ranking these guys relatively low on all these other ones, but I'd argue that the vocals in particular here have never sounded better, with more of a corpse grinder kind of flavor, and the riffs are really great too. I appreciate the expanded dynamics on tracks like Redemption in particular. Bind Torture Killer is a banger, as are Misconceived, Translucent Patterns of Delirium, and Entrails of You. Maybe not top of their discography here, but I really had a great time with this one start to finish. I almost considered putting it at perfection, but I'm just going to put it up really high at slightly greater tier.
Surprise, motherfucker.
All right, then we have Cannibal Corpse with Vile in 1996. So enter the corpse grinder himself on vocals with this album, bringing some new vocal dynamics. Getting very brutal again, but alternating the low grunts with raspy highs now. Favorite tracks here: Mummified and Barbed Wire, Disfigured, Eaten from Inside. It's a decent 90s death metal album, but I wouldn't say it's quite as memorable as some of their better material. It's kind of a B- overall, I would say, but on this particular list, I'm kind of wavering even between great and good. I'm going to put it at great and see what happens. All right, next up, let's do Dying Fetus with War of Attrition, 2007. So I've seen some consider this to be a return to form of sorts, but I tend to disagree, really.
Not quite my tempo.
It's kind of less of a punch in the face to kick things off with this one. I'd say it's solid, it's well played, but ultimately feels very generic to me, like just very processed and lacking in personality. Kind of style over substance in that, sure, it's very technical, but to the point of feeling very cold and detached. Rated among this particular list, and again, all of these lists are self-contained. I'm ranking them based on each other, not just based within like the broader context of all albums. So this one's actually going to okay, not my thing. Then we have Vader with Revelations in 2002. So another case of an album that's very good, but within the greater scope of this discography is a little more mid when put toe to toe with the likes of Litany, Impressions in Blood, and even Tibby et Igni. Some awesome songs. The Nomad has a great march to it. Love the drumming on Wolf Tribe. Torch of War has more like black metal sounding riffs. But The Code is easily the best song on here, through and through, even one of their best overall with those super hype riffs. Once more, a much more fun and engaging listen than a lot of the competition on this particular video. I am going to put this one at great tier. I am going to actually bump down Vile to good.
How dare you!
Next up, we have Behemoth with Thelema 6 in 2000. So in retrospect, I forgot to add Behemoth to the last video with Satanica, but they're finally going to enter the fray here as they move into a more death metal sound. So I know some fans out there love this album thanks to mainstay bangers like Christians to the Lions, Venom Sabati, and 23, the Youth Manifesto. Anti-Christian Phenomenon is a pretty killer intro too. I just don't seem to get quite the same thrill those people do listening to it from from start to finish when stacked against what I consider to be their better albums in the likes of Zos Kia Cultus and Demigod, but I will say that for whatever reason on this most recent re-listen, I was enjoying it a lot more. So this ended up being an interesting one to rank because within their own discography, I'd actually put it relatively low, but I'd still much rather listen to it than a lot of the other albums represented on this particular list. So it actually ended up on slightly greater tier. All right, next up we have Autopsy with Macabre Eternal, another mixed bag of an album. It's got some high points in dirty gore horror, Deliver Me from Sanity, Born Undead, and Macabre Eternal. Then it's just got a lot of other stuff that I kind of check out for. I will say that I agree with the fan ratings that this is probably one of their better albums overall, but it's still not something I get super excited to listen to because, again, regular viewers of this series know I'm just not a big Death Doom kind of fan and not a huge Autopsy fan, but I will put this one at good tier.
Move this man!
All right, next up, Pestilence with Resurrection Macabre in 2009. So after like a 16-year absence, Pestilence finally dropped a new album, but the only remaining member from Spheres was Patrick, now backed by Peter Wildoer on drums and Tony Choi on bass. Devouring Frenzy is a pretty banging opener, honestly, and Horror Detox continues the momentum of those more super chunky riffs and focus on speed and aggression. Definitely going for a more balls-to-the-wall sound here, with the progressive elements still present on tracks like Fiend, but toned down compared to previous records. I was kind of expecting to dislike this one based on the ratings I've seen, but it's honestly kind of a banger and one of the few albums on this list that I really enjoyed listening to all the way through. Like, pick a song off of this track list and you're gonna be banging your head with like Synthetic Grotesque, Neurodissonance, and Hangman. Honestly, I could almost put it in Perfection, but as it stands, I'm going to put it in the slightly greater tier, pretty high up. All right, then we have the much maligned Carcass Swansong, which I mentioned in my most overhated metal albums list. I have a soft spot for this one. I do think that this is getting a bad rap all the time. It's definitely lower in their discography, I would agree, but it's far from the worst thing ever. In fact, it's got some really fun, catchy, even anthemic tracks that are great to scream along to, like Rotting in the Free World and Black Star. Not to mention, it's just cool to see how many genres Carcass are able to cover in their career. So ultimately, I'm going to put this still low, but honestly, closer to the top of good tier. And maybe a hot take, but I'd rather listen to this than any other album in this tier.
Let the hate flow through you.
And then finally, we're going to close with Gorguts and Colored Sands in 2013. This is a concept album based on Tibet. Right from the onset, it's clear once again that this is not the same band as before, but not at all in a bad way. It's the same signature with a much more mature sounding presentation, more dynamics with lots of softer, more post-metal inspired moments with a drifting, dreamlike feel, making the heavier moments all the more craterous. And I appreciate that the vocals often know when to take a step back as opposed to the near constant rah 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 of the previous albums. It's kind of a more pleasant flow, actually, without sacrificing the complexity of the instrumentation, not to mention the great additional use of string arrangements. You know where this has to go. It's the only other album going to Perfection. Y'all check out this playlist for more death metal related videos in this series and beyond, and let me know again down in the comments what is your favorite 5th album from a death metal band. But that'll do it for now. Flight of Icarus signing off. I will see you in the trenches.